Hi, it's Todd at Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler here, and today I've got a very different kind of video for you. I was invited to speak at a conference, a Zoom conference called The Art of the Sword, where we had lots of different speakers, and I was one of them. But I got to sit down and chat to Peter Lyon. Now, Peter Lyon, for those of you who don't know, is the guy who brought us the Lord of the Rings swords and then Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe sword. So really iconic, really extraordinary pieces in the land of media swords, fantasy swords for film. But what was really important about Peter was he was really the person who proved that you could make a real sword but also make it fantasy and use those in films, because of course he is a sword maker in his own right as well as being known for the prop work. So it was an absolute thrill and pleasure to be able to sit down and have a chat with him, and that's what this video is. But before we carry on with that, it's a Zoom call, so sorry about the quality, that's the way it is, we all know it. But this whole thing was organised by a guy called Matt Blazek. History Northeast is the organisation, a non-profit that brings educational lectures and displays into, well, educational establishments, but does it in a thrilling way. So go check out his stuff, link in the notes, but also go check out the whole Art of the Sword conference that he organised. Again, link in the notes. But the last thing I'd like to say before I began is myself and Peter talked about reenactment. I began, and I love it, reenact at a place called Kentwell Hall. That's where it all began for me over here in the UK. 16th century Tudor reenactment. Go and check it out. It is a fantastic place. Again, link in the notes. And now on to the chat with myself and Peter and a bit from Matt. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the final session of the day on day 2 of the Art of the Sword, the Zoom Sword Conference fundraiser for History Live Northeast. I'm Matt Blazek, the Executive Director of History Live Northeast. Thank you all for joining us. Our last session today, we're going to have a great conversation with two fairly legendary people of the sword world with us. We have today Peter Lyon. You probably know him from works such as The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, and most recently the live-action Mulan movie that was on Disney+. And of course, we have Todd Torshini of Todd's Workshop. Not only famous for making the Witcher swords, but also doing lots of historical work in films such as Netflix's The King, The Outlaw King, which I have one of the Bollocks daggers that you made specifically for that one. And I love it. And also of his YouTube channel, Todd's Workshop YouTube channel, where he is doing all sorts of really interesting sort of experimental archaeology with bows and breastplates and all sorts of other things. So welcome, guys. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're just going to have like a sort of casual conversation here and start with the easy questions first, I guess. How did you both get started making swords?
Peter, go for it. Oh, okay. I guess I've been hanging around longer than most. For me, it was I started doing medieval combat practice in the early 80s, and New Zealand, worse than most of the world, we had no internet, no way of really getting stuff. So I decided I had to make things, and really it just all grew from there. I started very, very small, and eventually people decided they wanted to throw money at me, and I thought, well, maybe I could make a living out of this, and had a shot. Sort of scraped by for a few years, and then I got a call that there was a film project that they wanted me to work on.
Just a little film project.
Just a little one.
Yeah.
Weird thing is I didn't even realize what it was to start with, because for anyone that does film and TV work knows about confidentiality. So there were some big hints there, but I didn't actually cotton on for a while just what it was.
And when you did find out what it was, how excited were you?
Well, that's the weird thing, is I wasn't actually that excited because I didn't know what I was getting into. So my first reaction was basically, cool, I've got a steady job for a while. That's pretty much it. And it just grew from there.
And Todd, how did you get started in all this crafting craziness here?
I've made things since the day I was born, I think, and you know, when all my friends had little Fisher Price toy toolkits, my dad was buying me proper things that I could cut myself with, and did. So I was just making things from really as young as I can remember. And then I got massively influenced by a BBC programme where they, probably one of the first reality TV programmes, where they took, I think, 10 different families and they allowed them to live like Iron Age people for a year. So they had to go into the woods, build their own place and, you know, skin their own food and everything else. And watching that as an 8-9-year-old, I think it just completely got me into the whole concept of reenactment before I even knew that there was anything, such a thing as reenactment. And then I started reenacting when I was about 22, 23. But I just couldn't find any knives that I wanted that I felt were good enough, really. So I started making my own. I worked in special effects, so there was a full workshop there that I could do anything in. And I just started making my own and then just never stopped, really.
And what was the first sword you ever made?
I made a sword for an advert. And I think I was given the job because I was interested in them. I don't think I'd ever made a knife by that point. And it was, looking back on it, it was relatively plausible. So, you know, it was okay. And then the first sword that I made that I sort of set out properly myself to make a sword was a Wakefield hanger. I've always had a thing about single edge blades. I don't know why. And I made an absolutely appalling copy of one. It's unspeakable. Although, while we're on that subject though, first one is a classic. The first bollock dagger I ever made. I met a guy who'd heard about a bollock dagger who had never seen one himself. And he described it to me, and then I made one. And it was a wooden dildo with a spike on it. And it was brilliant.
So is this sort of a bit like Chinese whispers?
Yeah, it was exactly that. Exactly that. And the blade was mild steel. Beautiful.
Oh, jeez. There's a joke about it being too soft in there, I guess.
Yeah. That sounds a bit like my first sword. Was I was really heavily influenced by the Conan movies, particularly the first one. So the first sword I made, I started with 1/2-inch thick spring steel bar. I didn't even bother heat treating it. So you can imagine what it was, a two-handed sword just because it was so damn heavy. And it took me a few years to finish it up. But yeah, I looked back at that afterwards and thought, yep, I've come a long way.
Yeah, I think we all have in that way.
Now, you both, Todd more recently than Peter, but you both been working in the film industry for a few years now. How did you get started, or get pulled into the film industry?
Peter?
Oh, okay. Well, for me, it was pretty simple. I'd always had an interest in the technical side of filmmaking. I never wanted to be in front of camera, but I was really interested in how film was made, because the background stuff is always so much more complicated than people might think. It's even got more so today. And I happen to know Richard Taylor. It's one of those perfect stories about how in the film industry, half of it is who you know, and the other half is what you know. So I'd met Richard Taylor in 1994 because a friend of mine who was a stuntie said, hey, this guy, and he was doing effects for the Hercules TV series at the time. So he said, oh, you should meet this guy. He might be useful to know later on. And so I showed Richard a sword of mine in 94, and he was really interested, but he just didn't have anything for me. And he said, well, if the right thing comes along one day, I'll give you a call. And that day was 1998, 4 years later. So yeah, I got a phone call saying, hey, we're working on it, or getting ready to work on a project. Do you want to come in and we can chat? And it just, yeah, it all grew from there.
Nice stuff. Lucky day. So
yes, that story about luck. People talk about getting lucky, but half the thing is put yourself in a position where luck is going to smack you in the face one day, and you might do all right.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. But I actually did an engineering degree first of all, and then did an arts degree as a second one. And I was at my degree show, showing my work, which is sort of what you do. You exhibit your work, basically, if you do an arts degree. And a guy came around, I started chatting to him, and he did this thing that I'd never heard of. Bearing in mind, this is like 1990, 91, and it was special effects and model making. And I genuinely had to ask him what it was. You know, it sounds ridiculous these days, but so I had a chat with him, and he did animatronics at Jim Henson's, the Muppet people.
Oh, neat.
And he gave me a phone number. I rang up, and they were short-staffed on a job, and they said, "Well, can you start tomorrow?" And so my first job was at Jim Henson's, which was ridiculous. And so left there, and then started doing sort of model making and special effects and things like that, and then drifted more into TV work, specialist engineering for TV, like Scrappy Challenge, Junkyard Wars over in the States, those sort of shows. And then started making weapons in my spare time, lunch breaks and things like that. And then just moved over about 15 years ago, doing this full time, maybe more, 17 years ago, something like that.
But Todd, it sounds a bit like your story's a bit like mine, is that you sort of, most people in the film and TV industries have to spend like what used to be called the apprenticeship. You'd spend 10 or 15 years on low paid jobs, and then finally you'd get a break. And but yeah, we sound like we stepped in at the top rung.
Yeah, I actually stepped straight out of that. In fact, rather stupidly, I should have stuck with Henson's in that sense, because that was a phenomenal place to work and an extraordinary, exciting place. I wasn't involved with Babe at all, you know, that animatronic film, but I was there when they were making it, and you could, or when they were doing the research on it, and just looking at the animatronics, it was like scenes out of Terminator, but these things were real, you know. It was extraordinary work they were doing. So no, I was very lucky to get in there. But then I just hung out in the London advert world, really, and I enjoyed that much more.
So your engineering background explains how you're able to build something like it must come in handy on like those crossbow builds and things that you do, and some of these testing design things you're coming up with. That must come in pretty handy.
It does come in handy. But the other thing that's very useful that in the special effects world is somebody comes in, they say, "I've got a job and I need it out this afternoon." It might be ridiculous, you know, a ridiculous thing that you have to do in a day. And you just do it. You just learn how to do it because that's what you have to do. And commercially, that's made my ability to make a living making really quite a niche job. I mean, my job, Peter's job, was redundant 500 years ago, you know, and to be able to make a living at it is fantastic. And special effects is very helpful for that. Not in the sense that I still use it, but in the discipline of teaching you how to do any given job as fast as humanly possible.
So both of you now have really designed some of the most iconic swords from popular fantasy franchises. I mean, Peter with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Chronicles of Narnia, which the Peter sword is one of my all-time favorite fantasy sword designs. And then Todd, you've designed ones for The Witcher now. How did you approach designing and creating these items?
Maybe I should do this first because mine will be quick. I've got to admit that I don't design swords. Weta is one of these rare workshops that covers all the bases. So they've got a dedicated design department that does all this work. And quite often, the first time I see a design is quite late in the process. And usually my input is suggesting changes that will get rid of some of these little details that can soak up a lot of time to get them right. And just things that will make it, usually trying to make a sword design as a realistic sword that looks like it could be usable. And then what changes and tweaks might be useful. And of course, it's all signed off by the people paying for it. So in the end, they get what they want. But my input has mostly been to tweak designs. So an example like the Peter sword from Narnia, that was a complete design that was handed to me, and I just had to make it work as a realistic sword. Also, in this case, bearing in mind that it was going to be used by a guy who was quite young at the time, so had to be made as light as possible. And so that was like part of my job, is how do I remove any unnecessary weight out of this so that the actor doesn't say, I can't do this, give me the aluminium one. And, you know, I want the steel sword in front of camera as much as possible. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. I can't claim that much credit for design work, and I've actually learned a lot about sword design from people that are much better than I ever will be.
So a lot of people credit you on the Lord of the Rings with making fantasy swords actually work like believable swords, because a lot of the movies before that came, some of these fantasy swords were just behemoth pieces of metal that didn't flow or function like a real sword would. How much input did you have on making that happen?
Quite a lot. Yeah, this is what you get when you get a sword maker, not a props maker, to make swords. So I went in there with the mindset of, well, these are swords that are swords primarily to me, even though to people on set they're props. The only difference really between the swords I was trying to make and the swords that you would have used in period is that they were blunt for safety. And the nice thing there was also that Peter Jackson was really clear with his design directive that this has to feel like a world that's lived in it. The worst thing that, and we get examples of this all the time, is that you see stuff that looks like it's just walked out of a props department, brand new, off the shelf, not lived in. But with Lord of the Rings, there was aging on everything, costumes, weapons, the whole lot. So selling the world was about making it feel like a world that functioned and lived in. And so making swords that looked like swords that were usable was part of that whole aesthetic.
Todd, you, especially on The Witcher, you were a little more constrained though, because I mean, The Witcher, the designs were basically established through video games and literature, weren't they? How much did you get to play with that design?
Well, there's a few things going on here, and I have to be a little careful about what I say because everything's still ongoing. But Nick Jeffries, the head armourer, is involved very heavily in the design of the swords, and he, or all the weapons really, but I'm trying to find the right words. He builds, designs, creates a backstory to all of them. So even though it might just be a piece that just passes through camera for a second and belongs to an unnamed person, there will be a backstory in Nick's head about it. And so he comes along, we chat, we do an awful lot of meetings, face-to-face meetings, where we just chat about stuff. And he very much drives the design. But then what I'm doing is I'm also bringing in a lot of little bits of history in this, or oh, we could do this, you know, we could, if he's a bit thuggy, we could, you know, give him a short sword, or we can give him this nasty thing here, and Nick, oh, lovely. And it's very much a two-way thing with that. But Nick comes with a complete package of thoughts about it, even if there isn't a coherent design of the object that he wants. But he's designed the backstory, if you like. And then we chat it through, we come up with an idea, and then make it really. It's fairly simple. What we don't tend to have, we might put some sketches together of something, but generally, actually, we don't. So Geralt stuff, the Silver Sword, Meteor Sword, those designs were actually set and given right at the beginning. I adapted them a little like Peter, sort of taking some weight and some bulk out, because again, that's not something I'm particularly interested in. But I think you know, of sort of fantasy swords, which are all just unusable. But I think virtually everything after that, nothing more than a couple of little rough pencil sketches between me and Nick. So something like, Renfrew's sword, I don't think anything was even drawn. You know, we're just talking about it. It's like, well, it could be quite short. We could have a Type 14 downturned guard here. bit of a scent stopper pommel. You know, yeah, it sounds great, Todd. Go make that, and that's really nice freedom. Really nice freedom that gives me.
You mentioned the Type 14, and this goes into the next question here. It's like, so you're both have created these for fantasy franchises, but I know that both of you are also interested in history. Peter, you have the history of reenactment. Todd, you have a history of reenactment as well, plus your the YouTube channel and your historical blade business and other historical item business, weapon business. How does your knowledge of history and the historical design of blades shape how you create these things for the fantasy films?
Could I jump in front of Peter on this one, actually? Yeah, sure thing. Well, I sort of answered that because, already by saying that, well, I don't influence design that much.
All right, well, because you also said earlier on that you wanted to make your weapons, your film weapons, as real as they could be, so that they would, the look might be a bit different, but as usable as one from 1500 or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, it's sort of a funny thing with people that work in film is that they don't see swords as swords; they see them as props. So when I talk about how a sword would be used if it was sharp and what a sword was really made to do, I often get some fairly blank stares because they don't see swords as weapons. It's a whole different mindset. I see it as a weapon first that then has to be made safe, whereas they see them as a prop and only a prop.
But I think I work in exactly the same way as you, in the sense that I don't want to make a fantasy sword that couldn't be a real sword. Because I think, for me, what's really important is the subconscious for everybody works in a really powerful way. And you can not know anything about swords, but still, when you see something that's not right, that's really off kilter, somewhere in your psyche, things go, no, this isn't right, even if you know nothing about the subject. And I think that's true of everything. And so you've got to try and make the weapons as true to how they should be as possible, even if they look a bit weird in the historical sense.
So, Tom, would you say that you approach making things for, like, say, the Witcher the same or differently as, like, Outlaw King? I mean, the Outlaw King, I absolutely love the dagger smell. Like I said, I have one. I thought there's fantastic work in there. I absolutely love it. Do you take this? Does your approach to these change when you're making them, or do you sort of just like, nope, just making the sword, going for it?
So Outlaw King, yes, Outlaw King. I made 5 bollet daggers, 5 different bollet dagger styles. Now the film is set end of the 13th century, end of the 13th, I think.
Very, very early 14th, I think. Like it straddles, yeah.
So I know of one bollet dagger that I can sort of put my finger on a picture and go, that's from around the year 1300. I don't actually know of any others. I think they were started to come in after that, really. So when they say I need 5 bollet daggers for the year 1300, I can do one, but now I've got to do 4 more. Well, you can't, for 5 primary characters, you can't have 5 weapons that look basically the same. So you've got to sort of shake things up a bit. So in that sense, it is also fantasy, because I had to start pulling in other elements of bollet daggers, which were inevitably later on in the next 50 or 100 years, inevitably, and sort of mixing them up to produce 5 styles which are kind of bollet daggery, but actually are not bollet daggers of the year 1300. But there's only one I know of, so I'm stuck. So in a way, it's sort of fantasy work, but very well rested in the following decades, but that's the best I could do.
That's a cool way of approaching it, really. I mean, it's like writing the historical fantasy genre of books, where it's based in history but taking its own spin on it. So you've both been able to work on some pretty amazing projects, or at least a lot of, I don't know if you guys think it's amazing, but a lot of us think it's amazing. is there anything that you would really love to do but haven't gotten to do yet? Is there one project? It doesn't have to be film, or just like one project you guys would love to work on.
Lord of the Rings.
Yep. Yeah.
The old
pretty
one.
The old one.
I mean, yeah, I started on at the top basically, so everything since then's been comparison with Lord of the Rings, and I've got to say, Lord of the Rings is going to endure in a way that most other films that I've ever worked on just aren't. So yeah, and of course it's what I'm most remembered for, and I can see why. I watch the film every year or so again, on increasing resolutions on bigger screens, but it still stands up really, really well.
Yeah.
You told me though, Peter, that whenever you watch it, you think about what you would have done differently.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you got to remember that was me, a younger me, 20 odd years ago. So I've learned a few things since then, and like the steadiness of my grinding's improved a lot. There's one particular scene that makes me wince every time I see it, because I never expected a sword to get that sort of close up. It's the scene where Faramir's got his sword against Frodo. And
One of the hobbits.
There's this loving super close up that goes all the way along the sword to the tip, and at the tip I can see all my misgrinds running together, and I just like, I wish I'd done that a bit better. But everyone's their own worst critic.
What about Todd? Is there any, besides Lord of the Rings, Todd? Is there any one project that you'd really love to, like? Is there one thing you'd love to make? Because you are a craftsman and a maker, and you're constantly. I've been told that you basically sleep in your workshop because you're out there all the time doing stuff. So, is there any one thing you'd really like to make?
I would love to make a full-size trebuchet.
Me and you both.
Yeah, that'd be one. And I think for total weirdness, I'd quite like to make a leather cannon.
Oh, that'd be neat too.
Yeah.
Wow.
Totally weird things, but they existed.
So this was actually a question that my wife wanted me to ask you. Do you, and Peter sort of answered his. Do you both watch the films and series that your works have been in, or do you look at it and you're like, I can't even watch this? Because I know some actors they'll refuse to watch the movies that they've been
in. No, I do watch them, but not slavishly. I think probably much like Peter, in the sense of we've been in it for a long time and doing this sort of stuff for a long time. And you know, if you've appeared as an extra in one thing ever, then you're going to go and watch it because it's really interesting. But you know, when I've made 200 pop promos or something like that, I'm just not interested in seeing another one. You know, so not so much. But one thing that I haven't seen that I really, really should, and I just can't find the time, is Wolf Hall, and BBC's Wolf Hall. Which,
I didn't know you worked on Wolf Hall.
Yeah, so I did some stuff on that, and yeah, I've just never got around to watching it. Which is odd, but there you go.
Do you guys watch each other's work?
But,
yeah. Yeah, I enjoy Todd's videos. Like, I'm learning a lot from them. Yeah, especially your ones on crossbows, which seem to be your passion, and the longbow ones. Like, you know, answering questions that are thrown out there all the time.
Yeah, I'm finding that very interesting because my friend and editor Mike, who's another reenactor, and we sit around campfires drinking beer and chewing the fat over these things. And yeah, it's just there's so much that we have assumed that we know about longbows. And half of it is because, you know, I start reenacting when I'm 23, and then somebody who's 40 and has been reenacting the last 20 years, as far as I know, he knows everything. And so now I'm recounting the stuff that he's recounting. And at some point in my life, I go, hang on, is that actually true? You know, I've spent 20 years telling people, but actually, is it true? That's all I'm doing. It's just going to find stuff out.
So for anybody who hasn't seen them yet, Todd has a YouTube channel where he has been been sort of like a medieval mythbusters on some of these things here. The bee's nest that you have kicked with the longbow versus armor videos, or the longbow or crossbow versus the shield and padding videos that you've been putting out. How does it feel to know that you're just like you're churning up the internet with these?
It is really not my intention at all. No, I mean, okay. So arrows versus armor is very simply. You see videos of people on YouTube, particularly, and on TV documentaries. They're so guilty. Actually, I'm going to change that. TV documentaries, right? Because you've got a 30-minute slot. You've got to show something exciting because that's what your producer wants and everything else. And so you go and buy a 1.2 millimeter thick breastplate, and you shoot a powerful bow at it, and lo and behold, it goes through, and everybody gets very excited, and it looks great TV. And I've been watching these sort of things on telly and on YouTube, and there's just no balance to it. There's no looking at the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to take a breastplate that I knew to be true to what there was, and an archer and arrows that were true to what there was, put them together and find out what happens. And spoiler alert, the arrows bounced off the breastplate. Now,
if I can jump in here, what I found really fascinating in those experiments was the number of the arrows, if they got a hit or even a glancing hit, they pretty much all shattered. So there was no, if you hit anything, you weren't recovering those arrows either.
No, but that whole thing is absolutely fascinating. And we're going to come back, hopefully this summer, with another series of 4 more films in that line, where we're going to be looking at the helmet as well. But what I find fascinating, I've got a theory which we're going to talk about with the next films, but they could have made the arrows much more resistant to shattering, but they didn't. And if they'd made them more resistant to shattering, more of the energy would go into the target, but they didn't. And it's really interesting about why they felt that wasn't necessary, or it wasn't beneficial. And I've got a little pet theory about that, but I think that they, for various reasons, they wanted the splinters. And I think that that's why that French jupon that they wore, the padded garment over, it just stopped the arrows shattering completely, and it just snapped the heads off. And it changed completely what the arrows did. Still didn't penetrate the armor, but it changed the way they acted dramatically.
Yeah, is that because by going through the jupon first, you get a twisting force on the arrowhead that means that it can't transfer energy cleanly to the breastplate underneath?
Well, it wasn't going through the breastplate anyway.
But even the energy transfer, so instead of trying to push into the breastplate, it's already twisted the head, snapping the shaft possibly, and the arrows now just ineffective.
Don't know, but I think there's a good reason you want them to turn into dust.
Well, we can't wait to see that. We can't wait to see that tested out. Now, I'm sure a lot of people here are dying to ask questions. I see Peter's been answering them in the chat while you've been talking on and off while he's listening. But we're going to open up the floor here to hopefully we'll get some good questions from people. So if you'd like to type your question in the chat, I'll go ahead and read it out there.
Yeah. While we're waiting, something I'd just like to add further to what Todd was saying about our reading is, when I was younger, the books we had available, you accepted that these people were the experts in their field, but at the same time, you got to remember that the academic study of medieval history is largely about documents and political history. Not many of these people that are even top of the line academics have practical experience with stuff. So that colors the way that they assume things worked, because they're building on the work of previous people that have assumed certain things, and that colors the whole academic field. And this is where I'm hoping a lot of the reconstructive archaeology, like what Todd and others are doing, is going to actually start coloring the understanding of how things really worked.
It may well. Have you come across an author called Christian Cameron?
The name's familiar. I don't know if I've read any of his work.
Yeah, he's an author. He's an author and reenactor out of Canada.
Yeah.
He actually is a reenactor, so he tries to go out and actually experience before he starts writing things. He runs a deed of arms for harness fetching usually every year, outside of pandemic times.
But yeah, that's the point I was making. He really tries to live it as much as he can, and then writes what he experiences. So when he, he'll talk about the chafing on the inside of his thighs from the armor after wearing it for 3 days, and whatever. He gives it real color. I do enjoy his stuff.
Yeah, there's a prime example of how doing actually changes your understanding. Admittedly, it's not our period. It's to do with ancient Greece. But there was an expedition, I think it was called the Argo expedition, where they took one of the early Greek ship reconstructions. They took it up the Bosphorus. And what they found was that they couldn't just paddle against the current because it's quite strong through there, and they were doing island hopping from side to side of the Bosphorus. And then when they related that back to some ancient Greek stories, they realized that the course they'd had to do to avoid these strong currents actually followed some of these old stories. And so there's a good example of modern assumptions of you just power against the current don't apply. And there's a lot of that helps to understand a bit more about why certain things work the way they did.
We've got a couple of questions coming in here now. One sort of a compliment and a question for Todd. It said, Todd, it's a very nice arming sword you have behind you. And then they also want to know, might we get a look at your new, I don't even know how to pronounce it, the German knife, the Bernware?
What, behind me?
Behind you.
That one?
Yes, I think that's what he's...
Oh, there we are. Quite a simple blade.
We had a talk earlier of James Elmsley talked about single-edged sword.
Yeah, I do like them. Oh, you've ruined my display now.
Nolan asks, how often are the hero swords for movies are made out of aluminum as opposed to steel when on the screen?
These days, more and more often, actually. You got to understand that the hero steel swords, they're never used in combat scenes. They're only for close-ups, and they're very expensive. So you can make a few aluminium-bladed swords with painted urethane handles for the same price. And with modern paints, the techniques are pretty amazing. So like on Lord of the Rings, all the main hero swords were steel, but these days it's swung the other way, that very few swords are made in steel now. Unless Todd's experience is a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a stylistic thing. It might be sort of, Nick Jeffrey's preference as well. But the moment on which we're making everything in steel for close-up, so pretty much everything is done in steel. We don't use any aluminium at all. And all the fighting ones are in rubber. So they're in either a stiff polyurethane with stiffening cores down the middle, carbon fiber or glass fiber down the middle, or they're in a softer polyurethane, depending on what they're going to be used for. But no, we don't use any aluminiums at all.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, at Weta it's a bit the other way. We do occasional steel ones, lots of aluminium. Those are quite often CNC machined now, and especially the ones that have got very complex designs in them. And then we have urethanes for the fighting. And there also does seem to be an obsession these days with making the urethanes as light as possible. So we're moving away from steel armatures to carbon fiber, even though they cost a bit more.
Has 3D printing changed swords for the film industry?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Lots. Again, Weta covers all these departments. So 3D printing's a thing at Weta. It means that you can make pretty much anything a 3D modeler can design. You can make it, then finish it, surface finish it, and make molds off it, and then you can crank them out as fast as you like.
We're working on a History Live Northeast is starting to work on a big 3D printing project. We're actually going to take a full body 3D scan of me in armor, and we're taking it up to the University of Maine, and they're going to CNC 3D print a tomb effigy of me in armor, full size. So for us to take to schools. Part of the proceeds is going to that. So
right. So there's not something you're not telling us, is there?
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
No, it's me. It's just me. This is for a couple of questions for Todd now. Amelia Brown wants to know what university you went to.
I went to Leicester Polytechnic, now De Montfort University, then Royal College of Art and Imperial College of Science, Technology and Medicine.
And then the other one says, will we see high quality historical mail in the aero tests? I think you have been using.
No, I haven't yet.
Not yet? Okay.
Yes, you will. So there's a guy called Isaac Crowe who makes fantastic mail, handmade mail. And I have failed to use the samples he sent to me for the last 4 months, but that is coming very shortly.
Right. I've always heard that really high-end mail is damned expensive. Is that right?
Yes. So so for these tests that I've been messing about with, I'm using Isaac's work. Then there's another guy called Nick Chexfield here in the UK that is working on the arrows versus armor stuff with me this summer. I don't actually know what Nick's cost is per ring, but it's going to be around about 70 to 80 pence a ring, something like that. And there's a lot of rings.
Tom Billiter here in the US, he runs historically patterned mail. He does really nice stuff too. If I can put in a plug for a friend. So for Peter, it says in the extended Two Towers version during Helm's Deep, Aragorn slices through an Uruk leg in a close-up. How often did they actually use sharps to slice through dummies on the film?
Very, very, very rarely. In that particular shot, I don't think that was done with a sharp sword, because so they would have set it up so that you just see a very quick cut of the leg separating and the sword passing through. Probably, I don't recall ever sharpening an Aragorn sword for that. In the whole of Lord of the Rings, I can only recall 2 swords that I sharpened. One was a Nazgul sword for the stabbing scene in Bree, where they're stabbing the bed in. And the other one was a sharpened Rohirrim spear that had to stick into a dummy. The thing to remember is that when a weapon goes to set, they consider it a prop, and if it's got sharp edges, it actually is a real problem for them, because this could pass through a whole bunch of hands on set, and all you need is one person to not know it's sharp or mishandle it, cut themselves, and it becomes a big deal. So yeah, generally you avoid sharp weapons if at all possible.
Amelia asked if you know what 3D software they model in, if it's Fusion 360 or something else.
I'm not sure now, but they used to use Rhino a lot. I think there are new ones, but this is where I admit that I am a total numpty when it comes to computers.
Same here.
Same there. I was going to ask you how much modern technology comes into your making, but it sounds like not a lot. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what we say over here. So,
well, for me, yeah, but computers continuously break for me. I hate the things, but no, I mean, I use modern tools where I can use modern tools because it's faster. A lot of the work you have to do by hand, though. There just is no other way. But if I want a round hole in a bit of steel, I can drift that hole round, and it will take me however long, or I can just drill it. You still end up with a round hole, and yeah.
But one of the things I love about your work, Todd, is that you've got that hand-built look that's actually harder to get than a lot of people appreciate. like the difference between hand built and looking like crap is often fairly narrow. It's often, I've got the opposite problem, is that people are starting to expect me to produce stuff that looks like it's come off a CNC machine.
Yeah.
And you reach a point where you actually make stuff that you can make stuff that's too perfect. It stops looking like it was actually crafted. It looks like it's been machined.
Yeah. Well,
So
I mean, that's an interesting thing as well, because, you know, as everybody who makes things approaches it differently, and we all have our own signatures for stuff. But, you know, I want to make a sword. I don't want to be a person who files a sword guard for 2 days. I'm not a sword guard filer. I'm a sword maker. And so, you know, I want to make that sword. And if you look at any sword in a museum, you can look at a picture. And this, I showed the Ryde and Hilt one in one of my videos, the Ryde and Hilt sword from the Royal Armouries. It's a good example of this. People look at that sword and go, my God, it's beautiful. It's so well made. It's extraordinary. And it is an iconic piece. And you look at the picture and you go, that's fabulous. But then you look at the picture and it's appalling. The quality on it is just awful.
Have you been able to handle that sword, Todd?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So have I. Thanks to Bob. And yeah, the thing that surprised me is I was looking at the thing. Was it made this way, or is this repeated filings to sharpen it or something? Because the blades are wobbly. The hilt is really nice, but the blade itself is not that flash.
But the hilt still has casting flaws in it as well. I mean, it's by no means great. But no, that if you look at the spine on that blade, the spine goes to, I think it's almost 35% across one side. So it's not, you know, if you imagine 50% blade one side, 50% the other, spine in the middle, it goes to about 35%, 65%. The spine drifts. But the blade itself is actually fairly straight, but the spine wobbles on it. So I don't think it has been sharpened out. I think that is how it left the smith.
Yeah. This is something people don't appreciate, is how much imperfection, what we would call imperfections, were just considered standard. There's some very beautifully finished high-end swords with gold leaf and fancy hilts, but the blades themselves are actually wonky to the modern eye. But to them, that was not the aesthetic that mattered.
No, and it is interesting because there's another, I think, my memory is slipping, but I think it was the French archbishop's or somebody's sword. So somebody who had a lot of power and a lot of money. And he's got a beautiful enameled pommel on the sword with all his coat of arms and everything. And it's probably about 4 or 5 degrees skewed off square. So this guy presumably was handed the sword, looked at it and just went, oh, it's beautiful, I'll have that. You know, at no point did he go, can you reset that pommel? You know, but anyway, so coming back, you can't make stuff and sell it like that. You can't do it these days, but I don't have that interest of doing absolute CNC perfection coming out of my hands. It's not what I want to do.
Because really, if you're going to do that, why not just get the machine to do it in the first place?
Yeah.
So speaking about work, Jamin Brown asked, you said this is for you, Todd, the amount that your shop produces is impressive. How many people do you actually have working for you, and what do they do? From what I've been told, you never sleep. So that's... I do genuinely, I do work very hard. I have my amazing, I have an office team handling the whole Todd Cutler side. So my amazing wife and bizarrely other friends really from the village we live. It's so there's myself, there's on and off 3 or 4 ladies in the office. One of those is the amazing Lisa, who does a lot of, probably 90% of my leatherwork now, and she's quite extraordinary. So she's the name you don't know, but she's one of the biggest scabbard makers in the world, and she is fabulous. And then I've got sort of apprentice workshop help, up and coming cutler, Jenny, who works here. So there's myself and then 5 women, which is really bizarre for an arms company. It's fantastic. And then I've seen posts of you wrangle your kids in to help too sometimes, don't you?
Yes, I do. One of my children actually etched some of the lettering on Geralt's swords. So,
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so basically it's myself and one other in the workshop.
Somebody says, what about Lou? Lou? Who's Lou?
Lou's my wife.
Oh, Lou's your wife. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit like my situation. Like, I'm 57 now, and I'm actually training my replacement, is the way I'm looking at it. So a guy that I knew at Weta, who's also a good friend, Chris Menges, works with me and has for the last several years. So when there's sword stuff to do, I'm getting him to do stuff and teaching him techniques. He's doing things that I don't do, so I'm even learning a few things from him. But it's that thing of trying to think about, well, I'm not going to be there forever, and I'm not getting any younger. So it's that whole succession strategy. I don't know if you've thought of that yet, Leo.
Yeah. Yes, I have. I mean, it is interesting because speaking from my position, before me in the UK, there were 3 guys who used to make handmade knives, and they were just sort of tailing off their work when I arrived on the scene, and so I could learn some stuff from them, but not that much. Then I hung out a lot on a place called My Armory, which is brilliant, myarmory.com, which is brilliant for learning things. But really, my knowledge of how to make all this stuff has been very hard won. You know, nobody showed me any of it. I've had to learn it all. And it would be great to hand that on and to stop other people having to work so hard, really, to learn, you know, even quite simple things. And so, yeah, I'm sort of doing that a bit with Jenny. And then I imagine sooner or later we'll take on somebody else as well. And just try and keep that information, that knowledge going, really.
And then you can get to play the role of the master sword maker, just walking around critiquing everyone else.
Well, I think that's assuming that I've got some sort of like massive Dickensian style workshop, you know, medieval workshop. But I don't think we'll ever get to the point where I can tour the premises. But...
Well, Peter, burning question here from a number. I'm sure a lot of people would love to know this. Your website says that you're not taking commissions at this time. Are you ever gonna open up a slots again?
I don't really know. I've been in this situation for a few years now, and what it comes down to is that I'm getting older. My energy levels aren't the same. So, like, I finish a 5-day week at Weta, and I tend to come home and just not want to think about swords for another couple of days. So I have a home workshop that I'm upgrading at the moment, because during lockdown I learned the hard way that the workshop that I had left at home was actually functionally useless. So I'm in the process of upgrading everything so I can actually do stuff at home if we have another lockdown, but also just that I can do stuff at home if I want to. Whether I'm going to be able to take on any new work in the future, I'm not sure. I'm actually a little bit scared, because if I actually say one day, hey, I can take on work again, I think that there could be an avalanche heading my way.
It could be. Well, we're going to wrap up this final session for the day, but I have one more, the most important, most difficult question you're going to be asked this entire time. I'm asking it of all the presenters. What is your favorite sword?
Okay, well, for me, that's actually pretty easy. So Anduril from Lord of the Rings is my second favorite sword. My favorite sword is one that you actually probably haven't seen much of, even in the films, and that's the Aureus Centaur sword, the two-hander from Lion Wardrobe.
Yeah.
Like, it only gets a few seconds of screen time, unfortunately, but it's just my favorite sword. It's got a cruciform cross-section pommel, it's got etching, it's complicated, it's a big two-handed sword, and I have a thing for two-handed swords anyway. So that one is my favorite. So if you never find some good pictures of it, hopefully you can appreciate why I like it.
I see. And Todd, how about yours?
I'm going to go with one I've been spouting on about for years, which is the A489. I think it is. It's 489 or 479 for the Wallace collection. I can't remember which one. and it is a hand and a half German bastard sword, very wide blade, I think about 70 millimeters wide, about 10 mil thick at the spine, really heavy hollow grind on it. Yeah, just lovely twisted pommel. The whole thing's lovely. It's sort of slightly weird and slightly odd, and I think that's what attracts me about it. But also, as I found out while I was looking at it, it's probably a composite piece. It was probably never made like that, and should have had a much more standard, much narrower blade. But then it would be boring and ordinary.
Yeah. Well, Peter Lyon, Todd Toshini, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been a wonderful having you here today and talking with you. I'll let Todd go and enjoy the rest of his evening, and Peter enjoy the rest of his day, because he's, again, in New Zealand and in the future of us. Again, thank you so much. And we'll be back tomorrow, folks, at 10 a.m. And let me see what's coming back. Tomorrow at 10, it is Frank Perrin of Razmafar Martial Arts. He will be giving a talk called "The Scimitars Aren't Real: The Persian Shamshir and Its Uses." So thank you again, guys. Again, meant so much for you to do this for you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
It's been great. Cheers.